Hello, I am your librarian, Sarah, and I'm here to talk to you today about how to read a scholarly article. Before I get started, I want to give credit to my source. I've taken a lot of the content for this presentation from the article Reading Games, Strategies for Reading Scholarly Sources by Karen Rosenberg. You can see the citation there at the bottom of the slide. Whenever you use somebody else's ideas or writing, it's always important to give credit to the author of that information. So first of all, you may be asking yourself, what even is a scholarly source? For those of you that are pretty new in your academic career, if you're a first-year student in your very first term, this may be a term that you've never even heard before. But it's a term you're going to hear a lot throughout your academic career at EOU. And the reason for that is that in classes where professors require research papers, a lot of times they're going to require you to use scholarly sources when you write your research papers. So it's important for you to understand what they're talking about when they say you must use scholarly sources. So that's what we're going to do today. The first thing that you might notice is I've got some examples here on the slide. We've got Cell Research, we've got the American Sociological Review, and the Journal of Management. Each of these are responsible for covering a specific subject area. So if I were studying sociology, I would probably be reading the American Sociological Review. As a librarian, that's not a journal that I read. I read journals having to do with librarianship and information literacy. If I were a biologist, I might read something like Cell Research, but I'm probably not going to read the Journal of Management. If you are a business major, you're probably going to get familiar with the Journal of Management as you take management courses. So that's the first thing that you need to know, is that scholarly journals and scholarly sources are very subject specific. Here are some more examples of titles of scholarly journals, so you can kind of get an idea about how they are subject specific. For example, Analytical Chemistry or Journal of Applied Psychology. And you can probably get a sense that they're not the type of thing that you would just pick up to read for fun. They have a very specific purpose and they're read in a very specific context. And that will become a little bit more clear as we go on. The next thing that you need to know are some of the characteristics of scholarly sources. This is going to help you to identify scholarly sources. When you're looking at something and you're trying to decide, does this meet the requirement of my professor that the source be scholarly? These are the types of things that you should be thinking about. So expertise, this is the first thing. The people who write scholarly articles are experts in the field. So they're researchers, they're professors, they're usually people with advanced degrees, meaning they have a master's degree or maybe a PhD, and part of their work has to do with research. So they're researching on different topics, they write about that research, and that product of that writing is a scholarly article. They always are going to follow a structure. And that structure can vary a little bit depending on the subject area. So for example, the layout of an article for psychology might look a little bit different than the layout for an article in business. But within each field, each subject area, there's going to be a formal structure that articles will follow. And we'll see an example of that here shortly. There's going to be a lot of confusing vocabulary. So because these articles are written by experts and the audience is really other experts, other people who work in that field, there's going to be terminology that is hard to read for those of us that are regular everyday people or undergraduate college students, right? So in my field, when I'm writing for an audience of other librarians, there's certain terms and vocabulary and jargon that I might use that other librarians are going to understand, but you wouldn't necessarily understand it. A mathematician might not necessarily understand it. A business person might not understand it. Again, it's something that's really subject specific. But keep in mind, as you're reading it, you're not the audience. You're not necessarily expected to understand every piece. You're going to have to work a little bit harder in order to understand the content since they're not writing for a student audience. The last thing that you want to look for if you're trying to decide if something is scholarly or not is there a list of references? Anything that is scholarly, by its very nature, it's about research. And when we do research, we are always drawing upon other sources of information. We always cite those sources. So there's going to be a list of references at the end, like a works cited page or a bibliography. So if you're looking at an article and you're trying to decide, does this meet the requirement of being scholarly or not, those are some things you should look for. Who's it written by? Is that person an expert in the field? Does it follow a formal structure? Is there high level, kind of hard to understand vocabulary? And are there references listed? Here's an example of a scholarly article. You can see right up at the top it says research article, and then here we have the title, Magnetic Alignment Enhances Homing Efficiency of Hunting Dogs. There is a lot of text on this page, and this is only the very first page. As you scroll through, you can see it's very text-based. This one does happen to have some images, some photographs, as well as charts and graphs and tables and maps, all of those kinds of things, some statistical analysis. If we go all the way to the bottom, you'll see here's a references list. All right, so I am guessing if you are anything like me, this doesn't really look like anything that you want to read unless you happen to notice that it's about dogs and you like dogs. Maybe there's some appeal to that. But for the most part, this looks very dense. It looks like it's going to be really time consuming, and it looks like it's going to have a lot of vocabulary that I don't understand, and I'm going to have to take extra time to look up those words in the dictionary. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some strategies for how you can get useful information out of this article without having to read and understand every little piece of it. There's certain things that you're going to want to focus on when you read scholarly articles, and other things that you can ignore. So you're sitting there with a scholarly article in front of you. You're not going to read the whole thing from start to finish. You're really looking for these three things. What is the research question that's being asked, or what is the hypothesis that's being tested here? What did the researchers find? So what was their conclusion? And what methods did they use to come to their conclusions? That information, because a scholarly article follows a very precise structure, is going to be pretty easy to find. I'm going to tell you exactly where in the article you should look in order to find these three pieces of information. So in order to understand the scholarly article, and in order to get some useful information out of it that actually means something to us, we're going to employ rhetorical reading strategies. Now, it's not that important for you to remember that term right now, rhetorical reading, or to fully understand what it means. But what I want you to understand is that what we're doing is we are engaging more fully in the reading experience by thinking about how the text works. So we're going to be asking questions about the text and looking for answers. It's not just about reading the words on the page. It's about thinking about the material that's in front of us, how it's structured, who's the audience, giving us information that's going to help us understand the context around the material a little bit better. The first thing you're going to want to think about is the audience. So when you're reading a scholarly article, you, an undergraduate student, you are not the audience for a scholarly article. When you read a textbook, in that case, you are the audience. Textbook authors and textbook publishers write textbooks for an audience of students. A scholarly article is written for an audience of scholars. So the people who are meant to be reading scholarly articles and scholarly journals are academics, professors, researchers, right? So you don't necessarily have the same vocabulary as the intended audience. There's going to be a lot that you don't understand, and that's okay. We're going to focus on the things that you can understand and what's actually going to be useful and informative for you when you're reading these articles. The second thing that you want to think about besides the audience is this idea of an architecture or a structure. So every scholarly journal is going to have a prescriptive, meaning it's required, structure that authors have to follow. And that structure is going to be a little bit different from one subject area to the next, but you'll kind of get the hang of it. You're going to see some labels and some architecture around articles repeated in a lot of different subject areas. And as you get more used to it, it's going to get easier to figure out the pieces of the article that you need to read in order to get the information that you want. So one of the reasons why I ask you to think about who is the audience for this material is because there are things that you need to be aware of if you, the undergraduate student, are not the primary audience. The first thing is that the author is going to assume that the people reading their article have a certain level of knowledge and education that you probably don't have, because you don't have the same level of education as most scholars working in a certain field. The other thing is you're probably going to find that the writing is not very fun to read. It's not meant to be entertaining. They're not going to be using a lot of beautiful, classy, flowery language in order to communicate their points, especially if it's something in the sciences or social sciences. A lot of times the goal is to be as concise and direct as possible. Again, there's a lot of vocabulary that you're not going to understand. It's not something that you're going to sit down and read for fun. Now, if you do happen upon a scholarly article and you think it's super fascinating and you think it's super fun to read, that's often a good sign that maybe that subject area might be a good major for you, or might be something that you want to take classes in. But for the most part, at the level of undergraduate student, you're not going to find this all that appealing. The other thing that you need to think about is that you do not read a scholarly article from start to finish the way that you would read a novel or anything else that you read for pleasure. So think about the different types of things that you read in everyday life. And that can even just be like scrolling through social media or, looking at messages that you're getting from your friends. A lot of times you're looking for highlights, you're looking for titles, you're looking for labels. You're not necessarily reading something from start to finish, and that is absolutely the truth with scholarly articles. So before you get too deep into reading the article, you want to get the lay of the land, as the author says. You want to study the architecture or study the structure of the article first before you dive into reading it. So, to decode a scholarly article, we're going to look for three components first. You're first going to read the title. Now, in scholarly work, the title is usually representative of what the research is about. They usually don't come up with catchy titles that are meant to draw you in. The title, especially in subject areas like the sciences, should really reflect exactly what that research study was about, or maybe a key finding from the research study will be right there in the title. The second piece is the abstract, and we'll talk a little bit more about what an abstract is in a second. The third piece is the section headings. So again, it's following a formal structure, it's broken into sections. We're going to look through and see what those sections headings are before we actually jump in to read the article. So let's jump back to our scholarly article here. Now remember, there's three things that we are looking for first in order to understand this article a little bit better: the title, the abstract, and the section headings. So the first thing to look at is the title, Magnetic Alignment Enhances Homing Efficiency of Dogs. So this is telling me what this research is about. Basically, it's telling me that they found that homing efficiency of hunting dogs is enhanced by magnetic alignment. I don't fully understand what that means yet, but I'm going to read the abstract in order to learn more. The abstract is usually the very first thing in the article after all of the author names, and this is like an executive summary of the whole entire paper. An abstract should encapsulate what the research was about, what methods they used, what the major findings were, and what are the implications of those findings within a short amount of text. So a lot of times journals will have a word count limit, so they'll say you have to have an abstract of no more than 500 words. So because of that, they're trying to cram what might be years of research into a summary of only about 500 words. That means an abstract can be pretty dense and pretty hard to digest. It's not that uncommon for us to read an abstract and then think, I have no idea what I just read. And then you have to go back and read it again. So don't be surprised. Don't read through it, glaze over. If you find that you didn't understand what it said, go back through and try to understand what it said a little bit better. underline or highlight or make notes of words that you don't understand and look those up, and then reread it until you basically get what it's saying. If you can understand the abstract, you can understand the rest of the article. The third thing that we need to look at after the abstract is the section headings. So we have here the first one is Introduction, and I'm going to scroll through and look at the other section headings. Results, so that's kind of different. It goes Introduction, Results. There's some subheadings within this section on results. There's some tables and graphs and things. I'm just looking for the next section. Here it is, Discussion. So I'm recognizing it by how the font is displayed. So the section headings are bold, the font is a little bit larger, and they're in kind of a dark gray color instead of a bold black color as we saw with some of the other text. So far I've got abstract, introduction, results, discussion, and I'm assuming the next one is going to be methodology. Here we go, materials and methods. And then I'm going to keep going to see if there's any more. Again, these are just subheadings within each section. This all has to do with materials and methods because that's the section I'm in. Okay, then we've got acknowledgments, additional information, additional files, and references. All of those things at the end are less important. I mean, I think it's important for you to know that the references are there, but the main subject headings that we saw were abstract, introduction, results, discussion, and then methods and materials. Okay? So this helps me to understand the layout of the article a little bit. They're not going to tell me what methods they used or what materials they used until the very end. Knowing that, I can now go back and read certain sections of the article with a more specific intent. So we've read the title, the abstract, and the section headings. Next, we're going to look at the introduction. A good introduction should summarize the whole entire article, give us something of a roadmap of what you're going to read in the rest of the article, and tell us what the research question, hypothesis, or main idea is and why it's important, why we should care about it. Because the introduction serves as sort of a roadmap, it's kind of not unlike the abstract in that it summarizes the research that you're going to read about. You can always go back to the introduction if you find that you're not understanding something. So as you read and you start to kind of zone out or get confused, you can always go back to the introduction to ground yourself. Now, my advice for when you read the introduction is not read it start to finish. You want to start with the very last paragraph and then go back to the beginning. And really, the beginning of the introduction you're going to kind of skim. The last paragraph is really where they're going to tell you what the main problem is, so what's the hypothesis or the research question, and that's where they're going to give you the summary of what's to come. In the rest of the introduction, you're going to find what is known as the literature review. A literature review is a very specific piece of a scholarly article in which authors and researchers demonstrate that they're participating in a scholarly conversation that's bigger than their own research. And they do this by summarizing the research of other researchers that are studying the same thing or similar things to what they're researching. So in our article about magnetic fields and homing abilities of hunting dogs, in the literature review part of the article, they are going to summarize the research of other people that have researched how animals navigate and how animals use magnetic fields in order to navigate, in order to find their way home. The reason for this is to situate a scholar's research, so to place the research that this researcher is doing into this greater conversation. So while these researchers may be only interested in how dogs find their way around in the world, Other people are interested in how other animals find their way around in the world, and there's connections between different animals and how they navigate. So if one type of animal uses magnetic fields, maybe another animal uses magnetic fields, and that would be interesting to me as a researcher who researches animal navigation. So the literature review helps to show what's the research that has come before on this particular topic, and where are there gaps? What do we still not know? Where is there room for more research? And it will show why the research in the present article is particularly important and how it adds to the body of research on the subject matter at hand. In case you're getting a little bit lost right now, so far we have read the title, the abstract, the section headings, and then we have skipped to the last paragraph of the introduction in order to find out the research question or the hypothesis. Next, we're going to skip to the end of the article to the conclusion or the discussion. The label might be one or the other. In the case of the article we've been looking at, it's labeled as a discussion. Just like with the introduction, usually I'm going to skip to the very last paragraph because that's where they're going to summarize their major findings and explain why it's important. Once I've read that, I can decide, do I want to go back and read the whole discussion, or do I know as much as I need to know? So let's put it all together. You're going to read the article in this order: the title, the abstract, the section headings, and then the introduction. And remember, you want to start with the very last paragraph in the introduction because that is where they are going to tell you the main argument, idea, research question, or hypothesis. Once you have found out this information, you can decide how much of the article you actually want to read a little bit more deeply and which parts can just be skimmed. If you're seeing things like statistics and graphs that you don't really understand, usually as a first-year student, that's okay. You'll learn more about those things as you get further along in certain subject areas. Then you can skip to the conclusion or the discussion, and again, I usually start with the very last paragraph because that's where they're going to tell you the most important information, and then you can go back and read or skim the rest of the conclusion or discussion. I think you'll find when you employ these strategies, really looking for specific pieces of information and asking questions of the text, you're going to get a better understanding of what the researchers are actually trying to get across than if you tried to sit down and read an entire scholarly article from start to finish. Hopefully that's going to help you, and hopefully it's going to save you a little bit of time. Lastly, I just want to say, if you are feeling totally lost, if you're feeling confused, if you still don't really know what you're supposed to do in order to read this type of material for understanding, that is okay. Reading scholarly articles is not something that comes naturally to anyone right off the bat. It takes practice. I don't expect after watching this video that you're fully going to be able to dive into scholarly material on a subject matter that you don't know anything about. It can be unpleasant, it can be boring, it can be stressful, and that's on top of whatever feelings you might have about reading in general. So I don't want you to think that I'm suggesting that this is going to be easy for you right off the bat. I just want you to know that there are strategies that you can use in order to make the experience a little bit easier on you, and that there are people that are ready and willing to help you. So if you find yourself looking at a scholarly article, you want to read it, you want to understand it, but you don't know what to do and you're not understanding the material, remember that you can go to your professor for help and that your librarians are also available to help you with this kind of thing. So don't give up, be persistent. That's the most important thing, and good luck.